Hello, I'm Robert, and to a shorter version of this video about my new article. And it's no surprise that some of our members have got scared. My, how the media have played this up. And it's not true, there's no risk of World War III. Ukraine is not part of NATO. And Ukraine does not have any nukes. It gave its nukes away to Russia in 1994. And it did that in return to a promise by US and Russia and UK not to use force or threat against Ukraine. That's a Budapest memorandum in 1994, and it was signed by Ukraine, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States. And you might say, well, what about Crimea? Well, Russia did not invade Crimea with a big invasion force, and it claims that Crimea didn't want to stay part of Ukraine anymore, and that the Budapest Agreement did not commit Russia to force Crimea to stay part of Ukraine if it didn't want to. That's how Russia excuses it. Now, that is very different from Russia invading Ukraine with a big army, fighting Ukrainian soldiers. There's no way that it can say that the territory has taken was that was consistent with the Budapest memorandum, because it's fighting, and it's not because Ukraine wants to become part of Russia. So it'd be very, very clear violation of the Budapest memorandum. And you might say, well, what does that matter for Russia? Well, the reason that matters is because the Baltic states have many Russian sympathizers, and Russia's aim is to try and restore some of the former USSR. Russia can never restore all of the former USSR, because most of the former states are already part of NATO. But Russia can restore some of the former USSR, maybe Belarus, maybe Georgia, and it has its eyes on Ukraine, which was the second most wealthy part of Russia, of USSR, and it'd be the kind of the jewel in the crown if Russia was to somehow regain it. But there's no way it can do that with an invasion. So with an invasion, it would have just about all the Ukrainians against Russia, and it would turn all the other states, many of their citizens, against it, because it's such a clear violation of the Budapest memorandum. So no, Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. I'm going to come back to that in a bit more. And Putin has said many times that Russia will not invade Ukraine. So we get the news saying over and over and over, and it's very like the false prophets we get, saying over and over that something dire is going to happen tomorrow, and then when nothing happens they say, oh well, we got it slightly wrong, it's going to happen the day after. And then the papers are doing the same. They're saying that they keep saying that Russia's going to invade Ukraine. It never does, because it's not going to. And then you get people saying, but Putin's mad. But he's not mad. He may be ruthless, but he's not mad. And Putin would not benefit from radioactive ash falling on Putin's palace, luxurious place and the other oligarchs that support him. And one person can't control a country. Neither President or Putin can't, Biden can't either, nor Boris Johnson. No one person can control a country, whether it's democracy or it's an autocracy. There just isn't any machine, any psychological approach. There's no way that one person can control the country. And if Putin went crazy, then he would soon be deposed. And the oligarchs would find someone else to take his place. And this is about the excuses that Russia, the Western call it a blatant memorandum, but Russia says that the provisions don't apply to circumstances resulting from the action of domestic, political or socio-economic factors. In other words, that the Crimea really wanted to leave Ukraine and Russia didn't, and it goes on to explain in more detail that that's what they meant. And this makes absolutely no sense as military strategy, because if you think about it, then if Ukraine wanted to invade, if Russia wanted to invade Ukraine, then it would have done it. Its perfect opportunity was early in 2021, when NATO was giving very little attention to Ukraine. Things have been pretty quiet for years, with some action still in the Donbass region. And if Russia had suddenly gone in there with 120,000 troops, it would have faced fierce opposition, but it was its best opportunity. And it doesn't make sense to wait for Ukraine to get stronger and stronger, for NATO to send it its most up-to-date weapons, and then to spend months and weeks training these soldiers in how to use these new weapons, and then for NATO to work out in great deal exactly how they're going to sanction Russia. And then at the end of weeks and weeks, and then when finally NATO has polished the last details of the sanctions it's going to use against Russia, and when Ukrainian soldiers have all learned to use their new weapons and been sent much more military aid, then the mastermind behind all this, the generals that told Putin what to do, then say, we've got the exact moment now, this is exactly what we've been waiting for, this is when we're going to invade Ukraine. And how does that make sense? So just think about that. And Putin is shrewd, and they're not amateur generals. They've had lots of experience, lots of military experience. So this makes absolutely no sense and so that makes absolutely no sense if Putin wants to attack Ukraine, then what he's done makes no sense at all. But if he wants something from NATO, then it makes a lot of sense. And so we don't think that Russia really has eyes on Ukraine as territory that it's going to try to invade. But it wants concessions from NATO as to what it's going to do in Ukraine and what's going to do in the border regions in the other Baltic states. And so that's what this is all about. And the whole thing about NATO, Russia saying to NATO, you can't accept Ukraine as a member, then Russia absolutely knows that NATO has open doors policy. It just needs to read the treaty itself and look at the various discussions of it, and they know absolutely there's no way that NATO even can, or that the United States even can, say that it's going to go against the open door policy and be going against the very spirit of the NATO agreement. So that's a straw man. There's no way that Russia really expects that. And so when they make these constant protests, then a way to think about that is like bargaining. It's like two people haggling over the price of cakes or something. And one person says, you can get my cake for $50. The other says, no, I'm not willing to go that high. And then he says, oh well, you can have two cakes for $45. The other says, well, how about two cakes for $30? I say, no, I can't go that low. And then the first one says, well, I'm not willing to buy them at 45, and they're going to walk away. And then the next day they come back again, they try buying the cakes again. I mean, it's very much like that with what's happening between NATO and Russia. They're just bargaining. And so they speak tough. And then Russia is currently looking at NATO's proposals, and you can expect stops and starts. You can expect this to go on and on and on for days and weeks, and eventually they'll come to some agreement. I mean, look at the Iran deal. That took months and weeks. I don't know how long that took. It took ages to sort out the Iran deal. So you can expect this to take ages. It might take a long time, but eventually they will sort it out. And well, it seems NATO is offering an awful lot of Russia wants, and Russia is playing for even more concessions from NATO, and NATO is asking Russia what it wants. At some point, we're going to have another summit between Putin Biden. At some point, the negotiators go back again, and then we get more of this, and that's all going to go on for the next several weeks. And one of the main things, the backgrounds to this, is that is the United States withdrawing from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So Russia, since then, has done voluntary moratorium on INF forces. So Russia is obviously very keen on this agreement, and it has been asking NATO to join in for this voluntary moratorium. And NATO has gone back with something even stronger. NATO is willing to recreate the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty is gone, but starts a new treaty like that. And that is likely to be very attractive for Russia. And then NATO has also agreed to be completely transparent about military maneuvers on both sides. Many other things are concessions to Russia. And Biden is not, the troops you hear about are not combat troops to Ukraine, they are just troops to guard NATO. And if in the event of the invasion, which everybody knows is not really going to happen, then NATO would set these up in the borders around in neighbouring NATO countries to make sure that the Russian troops don't invade them and do little excursions into other countries. And so Russia says it's not going to invade, makes no military sense, but expects stop and starts in the talks. And now this is something William Else said in the talks, that Russia's whole negotiating strategy is based upon a threat to invade. It needs to seem like a real threat. Now, Russia is not actually threatening to invade as such. It's not saying I'm going to invade, but it's put a big army next to Ukraine, and that leads to NATO to say, well, that army could invade, and that's leading to the negotiating position for Russia and leading Russia to ask NATO and US for concessions. And its whole threat is based on that big army being there. And if Russia sent that army home, then it would have very little left by way of bargaining chips for its bargains. And in the same way, if NATO didn't react in any way, if NATO didn't send its forces to go and protect NATO nations and didn't send weapons to Ukraine and so on, then Russia would feel it needs to do a little bit more in order to get NATO's attention, and it would may try a little invasion of Ukraine. So you can say in a way that what NATO has done has prevented Russia invading Ukraine, but really because Russia would have only done such a movement in order to get the attention of NATO. It's got that attention, it's got the negotiations, and really I don't see this as being anything like a planned invasion. It makes no sense. And as William Else put it, it's like when two stags fight, a lot of noise and fury signifying nothing, just redefining the borders between the two. So something to bear in mind with how stags fight. Then notice how their antlers look. You may not know this, you've probably seen these fights of clashing antlers that deers basically rush each other and interlock and bang their hands together, and they clash together, and then they kind of tussle with their heads and push against each other and try to prove who's the strongest. What you may not know is that those antlers are pretty lethal weapons, and very occasionally deer and stags make mistakes and they gash each other's sides, and that often leads to a deer dying. So the two stags could easily kill each other, much more easily than. So if one of the stags was to go up and by surprise, go over the flanks of the other one would die, and the first one would get the one that attacks territory. So that's a very easy way of winning that a stag could do in principle. But they never do that. They never try to kill each other. They just always do these ritual combats. And it's very like that with the way that these negotiations happen and these invasions and things. They're never going to try to invade each other. You're just doing these ritualized marches, very much like the stags locking their antlers. And then another thing, just kind of double down on that they're not going to invade each other. It's the Russians saying that the first blini or pancake is always a mess. That's when you make them. The first one you make is apparently always a bit messy. And the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's largest combined arms operation since the Battle of Berlin in 1945. They've never done anything like that before. They'd be bound to mess things up a bit and not really work very well. And it's not going to be easy to invade Ukraine. Russia is very dependent on railways, apparently, to do its invasions. So there are only a few places it can actually invade. And the main way it can actually invade, unless it just does a token operation to kind of secure the water supply for Crimea or something, but fresh water supply. But apart from that, if it was to really do a proper invasion, then it would have to go along these railways. That one would involve sea rather than railways. And to do that, then it would encounter this very large city of 1.5 million called Kharkiv, the most obvious way to do that. And its city fighting is extremely difficult, as we've seen, like for instance when the United States spent ages trying to capture individual cities in Iraq in the Iraq War. Then any kind of war involving cities, it's very, very, very difficult, and Russia wants to avoid that. And actually invasion along the it's actually very, very slow. Very fast invasion is 20 miles a day. She was talking about invading Ukraine, talking about something that takes weeks, and then whole stops at certain points. Like for instance, when they're trying to capture Kharkiv, that's going to probably take a long time to do that, maybe a week or something to capture it all, and eventually they'll blow up the roads and the railroads, so it is supposed to hamper and flood the river, so as to hamper the Russian troops even more. So you're talking about something very messy and very long term, and lots of Russian soldiers dying because of the fancy new anti-tank weapons that the NATO has given them, that they can fire at the Russian troops as they drive their tanks across the Ukrainian countryside to try and invade. There's no way that Russia wants this. And then we've got the notorious spring thaw. At the moment it's very frozen. It'd have to be night fighting because it's mainly dark, but it's very frozen and hard for tanks to be able to cross easily. When it comes to March, and you've got the notorious thaw, where the whole area turns into bog and marshes and quagmire and peat bogs, and there's no way that they want to continue, even though they could very slowly. They want to grind forward through all that mud through March, April, the rest of the year. They'd be stuck with the thaw in early March. They're not going to want to go on grinding through the thaw after that. So although they're talking about this, Biden is warning that, or someone is warning that Russia's going to invade in February, it's really highly unlikely. They're not going to get very far before the bogs in March, given the amount of fierce resistance there would be from the Ukrainians and the amount of reluctance there'd be from the Russian soldiers. Morale would not be very, maybe to start with the morale would be okay with the Russian soldiers, but continually in these very difficult, horrible conditions, and dark and cold and night fighting, and then lots of them dying with tank buster weapons, and the photos and videos sent back to the relatives at home. The morale is soon going to sap in the Russian troops, and meanwhile the Ukrainian troops are going to start getting victories and saying, oh well, we can delay them quite a lot, maybe we're going to win this. The morale boost is going to be on the Ukrainian side. And it's not me saying this, these are some of the authorities that I've been reading. Some people who know a lot about these things. And so really, this is not good. This is not something Russia wants. Putin would probably be out of office not very long after that if he did something like that. Because just like happened with his predecessor with the Afghan war. So no, this is not a likely thing to happen. And so anyway, I've done a much longer video about all this, but hopefully this helps you be a bit less scared with a shorter video. And just think of it like this. And we're going to have loads and loads of these media stories. And Zelensky has been the Prime Minister, the President of Ukraine, has been very critical yesterday, I think it was the day before, whatever it was, saying that this is the media at causing panic. He says we don't want panic because this is making things bad for the Ukrainian economy, and you don't want that. NATO doesn't want that. So, so it's really the mainstream media feeding a lot of this. Don't pay any attention to it if you can. Journalists love a good story. It gets them, not a good story, a bad story. Journalists love a horrible story, really, because it gets lots of clicks and views and lots of shares. But it's not true. And I hope this has made it a little bit clearer as to what's going on, and hope you try reading my videos and reading my articles and watching my videos. And so I've done these videos. This one is a longer video. Kind of watch of it when you're getting scared, and just try to reduce your, if you can, try not search so much for these stories, and try and reduce your exposure to all this, and think about things that are worthwhile and things you enjoy, and let these, think of them as like battling deer, and let them just get on with it, and and ignore the mainstream media. They always do that. You've seen them do that before with climate change and North Korea and Nibiru with the sensationalist press and the false prophets and David Mead and all the asteroid stories, and even not above the New York Times and BBC with the climate change and so on. You've seen all this before, and it's just the same, much the same as all that, and nothing's going to come of it. No big war, no World War III, no nuclear war, and it's extremely unlikely we have any invasion of Ukraine, and certainly not a big invasion, extremely unlikely we have even a minor conflict, because Russia has already got the attention of NATO. It's probably got more attention than it even wanted. So I really don't think that we're going to get anything like this. So I'll just switch this off. That's the end of the video. Upload it. Hope it's helped you.